And while we're on the topic of events coming up, please mark your calendars for October. Our October meeting will be Sunday, October 16th at 2 p.m. instead of our traditional second Sunday because of the Columbus Day weekend. At that time, Ravena Nahan, who is the culinary historian for the State Office of Park, Recreation, and Historic Preservation's museum program. She's an interpreter in culinary history. If you've ever been to Fort Crello and some of the other colonial sites, you may have encountered Ravena doing first-person interpretation of cooking, which is brought to the state park sites, the state historic sites for New York, is an interesting twist, kind of doing the research on how slaves, West Africans, brought culinary influences into the early Dutch homes and how that evolved into a variety of different fares that were being eaten and how that food was being prepared. So Ravena has a really interesting talk prepared for us on culinary history of the Dutch colonies and the timeline of that, so if you're available, please come over for that. Our November program will be Dick Muggio, who is a trustee with Greene County Historical Society. Dick is also a regional expert on Dutch beer manufacturing. So Dick is going to bring that experience to us and talk about kind of soup to nuts, the process by which the Dutch were fermenting their beer. Obviously beer was better than water because it tended not to make you sick and die. So it's a very important part of our Dutch culture in these communities, and we hope to have a great talk by Dick, and we're also trying to right now work out maybe a nexus between some new businesses in this town and the history of brewing. So November could be a really good meeting. It will be a good meeting, but hopefully it'll be better because maybe it'll be stoppable. Right now, that meeting is scheduled for either November 6th or 13th. 13th will be our traditional day, the second Sunday. Dick has some scheduling issues he's working out. Watch the website and our postings to see which of those days it will be on. So we're looking forward to that. Lastly, our end-of-year open house, winter open house, December 18th or 11th, Joe?
11th.
11th.
The second Sunday of December.
So there you go. Not only will it be kind of our traditional open house for the end of the year, but also, as I noted, kicking off 2023, which is, again, the 350th anniversary of the town and 25th anniversary of the founding of the organization. Okay, with all that, and I should also mention, since we're all historians, that this week we've witnessed history that we talked about for a long time. We're seeing the transition of a royal family, of a monarchy, which, gosh, you know, it's long before me, the last one. Not that long, but long enough. And, you know, it's going to be something that historians will talk about 50 years from now as they begin to put together what this whole transition means for the British Isles and the kingdom, and how long the kingdom survives, you know, who knows. So, we'll all see how things play out, and it should be an interesting week of historical events to watch. A lot of pageantry we don't get to see on this side of the ocean. With that long-winded bit of business, I'm so pleased to introduce James Bradley. James was supposed to have joined us in January of last year. COVID prevented that. Luckily for us, his schedule was still open and we were able to get him here today. James is the co-editor of the Martin Van Buren Papers, which is a project operating out of Cumberland University in Lebanon, Tennessee. The Van Buren Paper Project will transcribe and annotate and edit 13,000 documents connected to the former president, Martin Van Buren, and his life. They're to be released digitally and in print editions. He is also writing a biography of Martin Van Buren, which is scheduled to be published next year, fingers crossed, by Oxford University Press. He's also a guest lecturer at the State University of Albany in their graduate history program. With that, I am pleased to welcome James Bradley.
Okay. Is the microphone on? No, it sounds like it's on. Okay, well, thank you very much, John. Thank you all for coming. I'm delighted to be here to talk about the anti-rent war, which I think is it's a really fascinating topic, and it's often portrayed as a local conflict, and in many ways it was, but it was also one that had wide ramifications, not just in the state of New York, but really all over the nation. So we're going to discuss the anti-rent war. I'm going to place a particular emphasis on the political parties. Martin Van Buren, who was very much a big player in this, in the nation at the time, and how this whole situation played out. Here you see one of the prominent flags of the anti-rent movement, Down with the Rent. This was their big rallying cry. The tomahawk, the tin horn, the Indian garb, this was all a big part of the anti-rent uprising. You've all seen these signs. They are all over the area, and you can see how over the years the anti-rent war is still a controversial subject. It's still been portrayed in a number of different ways. The one on the left here refers to how the anti-rent movement, they were protesting the unfair land rent system. And the one on the upper right mentions how a sheriff was murdered. So you can see some emphasize the fact that the anti-renters sometimes resorted to violence. The other one talks about the unjust systems they were living under. So you can see this all throughout the region. So it gives you a good indication of how the anti-rent war is still on people's minds, and it still presents itself in all kinds of ways. What's fascinating about the anti-rent war is there are many things fascinating about it, but there was actually a period when Hollywood was interested in this. In the 1940s, Hollywood came calling, and they made a movie called Dragonwyck. Has anyone here seen Dragonwyck? No one's seen Dragonwyck. How many movies are made about the anti-rent war taking place in your backyard? Well, it was a big movie actually at the time. It was, I think it came out in 1946. It had a lot of big stars. Darryl F. Zanuck was the producer. Joseph L. Mankiewicz was the director, the man who went on to make All About Eve. Gene Tierney, Vincent Price, a lot of big names were in it. I don't think the class angle is something that interested Hollywood so much. I think they wanted to do a gothic melodrama. And this was a popular genre at the time. Things like Jane Eyre, Wuthering Heights. And somebody in Hollywood said, can't we do one of these in our own nation? Do we have any castles and gabled mansions back in the day? Someone came up with this. So Dragonwyck is obviously a reference to Rensselaerwyck. The patroon is played by Vincent Price at his hammiest. Before the horror films, he was usually playing types like this. They called him Von Ryan instead of Van Rensselaer. And I'm going to show you a clip. So, Joe, I think you got it all set up. Before you show it, let me just give, I'm going to show you a 3-minute clip from the film, which will give you kind of a nice warm-up to this discussion.
Let's get the sound right on. It must go out by itself.
So here's the scene where the patroon comes to collect the rent, and the tenants are all gathering.
What brings you to our Coeymans, Dr. Turner? Are you expecting an epidemic of minor injuries?
You never can tell, Mr. Van Ryn.
This chair came from Holland with the first patroon. It represents, among other things, over 200 years of extreme discomfort.
The patroon is ready. The first man will come forward, bringing with him rent and tribute. Class Bleecker, Hill Farm, rent, winter wheat, and... You brought nothing with you, Class?
No. Perhaps your crops were poor.
My crops were all right.
Take your hat off when you speak to the patroon.
I'm a free American citizen. I take my hat off to no man.
What you do with your hat is your own concern. Are you ready to pay your rent?
No. Nor will you ever again get so much as a grain of wheat from me.
It is your purpose, then, to farm my lands and enjoy the privileges I allow you without making any return.
Your lands? Did you hear that? His lands. For 200 years, the Bleakers have worked the hill farm.
And for longer than that, it has belonged to the Van Ryn.
We've paid the worth of it many times over, and you know it. Well, here's the finish.
I'm sorry to hear it. But since you feel that way, I order you to leave my land by tomorrow noon. If you are not gone, I shall have the proper authorities put you off. Have the next man step forward.
Otto Gebhardt.
Won't you reconsider your decision, Mr. Van Ryn? Klaus Bleeker and his wife and children have no home other than this farm. Where will he take them?
I see you've come empty-handed, Otto. Have you a reason?
You know the reason. It's his birthright as a free citizen of a free country. These men are not alone. The anti-rent movement has swept New York State. Man, take your head out of the sand and help to solve this problem peacefully. Because it's got to be solved, peacefully or not.
Speak up, Otto.
I'll bring the stuff tomorrow, sir, if that will suit.
Will the rest of you men step forward, please?
I have something to say.
Tired of listening and talking and listening.
Klaus just lost his head, that's all. He doesn't mean violence any more than the rest of us. I hope you'll overlook this.
I suppose I must regard what you did as an effort to save my life, Dr. Turner. And whether or not I regard you as a meddling trespasser, I suppose I must thank you.
You've got the facts wrong. The way I see it, you're the trespasser. Also, saving your life wasn't what I had in mind. If Klaus had killed you, it would have done these men infinitely more harm than you could ever do alive. So don't thank me, Mr. Van Ryn.
I shall say a few words about what has just happened, and they will be my last. Dr. Turner's efforts to incite anti-rent rebellion in our local district have been well known to me for many months now. Just what is it he wants you to want so passionately? It has an assortment of highly romantic names: the rights of man, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and such. And all those will be yours with the titles to a few acres of soil. Believe me, my welfare does not depend upon you. Rather, you depend upon it. But my rents and tributes and my responsibilities are hereditary, the symbols of a way of life to which I have been born and in which I shall continue to live. I shall never relinquish my position.
All right. So to get us back to New York. Did any of you recognize the tenant agitator there? Who was, that was right. That was Harry Morgan, who played Sherman Potter on MASH. Yeah. I hate to throw a bucket of cold water at everyone like this, but that's not how it all really went down. A friend of mine, Dr. Charles Garing of the New Netherlands Institute, I asked him once, I said, was there ever a period, maybe, when the patroon sat in a big wooden chair and people brought in rent? And he said, no, nothing like that ever took place at all. But it was certainly dramatically portrayed there. But there was one moment in that amusing clip that I think carried a lot of truth to it. And it's when the Bleeker character, played by Harry Morgan, says, you have recouped your investment many times over. We've given you your worth, and now it's gotten to the point where they just felt like they were not exercising their rights as American citizens. These notions were very deeply ingrained in the people of New York at this time. That where they were within the state's political system and the way the economy was shaping up, and this is a bigger, longer story that deeply affects the anti-rent war, that they thought that they had already given the patroonship back all of the investments that were already made in their territory. And that was really what prompted about the anti-rent movement. But we're going to go a little bit to the beginning now to find out, where this all started. And I'm not going to, there we go. It's going to go back to Kilian Van Rensselaer. He was the first patroon in the 1630s. The Dutch West India Company, they wanted to populate New York because we didn't have any sort of real physical presence here. So they looked for investors, and the investors were given the land as long as they made the necessary investments to develop the area and to get people to come from the Netherlands to the United States. But that was a very hard sell because the Netherlands were very prosperous at the time. The New World was far away. They knew all about that there was the native population there and that there had been a lot of fighting. But nevertheless, the patroon was managed, it was able to get what became New Netherland, to develop it. And some people from Holland did come to the New World. And one of them was Martin Van Buren's great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, Cornelius Maassen. So this land now became Rensselaerwyck. And there you see it. Of course, this map does not really give you an indication of how big it was. Estimates vary from 750,000 to 1 million acres, which is bigger than Rhode Island. So this was by far the biggest of the manor estates in New York. And there were several of them. The second biggest was Livingston Manor, which is a little bit south. That was about 150,000 acres. But Rensselaerwyck was by far the biggest. It got a patent from the British government when there was the takeover in the 1670s. And throughout this long turbulent period, and it was from the 17th and the 18th century, there were these occasional flare-ups of violence of tenants demanding independence, because in the late 18th century, when the American Republic was formed, they were not allowed to vote, because voting rights were something given only to white male property owners. So this entire area was essentially disenfranchised, and it was something really concentrated in the power of the Van Rensselaer family, and as well the Livingston family. A lot of these big names you hear, like Van Cortlandt and Phillips, these were big families that owned lots of territory and had all these tenants living under them, and they exercised enormous power in New York government. And these things began to change in the 19th century, especially after the War of 1812, when there was a lot of fighting in New York, because we bordered British Canada. We saw a lot of fighting, a lot of soldiers returned, maimed, injured, and they had lots of struggles with their landlords in getting their land back, owing back rents during the time they served in the war. So there was an enormous push in the 1820s to extend voting rights to people who didn't own property, and it was granted. So in the 1820s, white men were given the right to vote regardless of their property status. Now throughout this there have been 9 patroons, and here's the last one, Stephen Van Rensselaer III. Now things were relatively harmonious under his tenure. He was called the Good Patroon, or the Benevolent Patroon, because these terms are relevant based on the status of the time. But he was known as someone who was much more lax and lenient in the way his property was run. Tenants were given long-term leases. They were a little more flexible with payments. You could pay in crops and things like that. And in general, he decided that he would rather have better relations with the tenants than be super strict in how the enforcement was done. So he had a good reputation. This is the 1820s, 1830s. He was a long-time Federalist, so he was very emblematic of the day's politics of deference, the idea of politics is something for men of stature and wealth, and a lot of people who were the merchants or lawyers. Well, he was very much part of that whole system. He led the New York militia, and not very well, during the War of 1812. He was a major general, and he bungled the Battle of Queenston Heights. And his tenure there was very controversial. Nevertheless, they made him a candidate for governor in 1813. Lost very badly to Daniel Tompkins. But he was elected to Congress, and he actually cast the deciding vote in the presidential election of 1824. No one got a majority of electoral votes. That election went to the House of Representatives. New York's vote, he was the deciding vote. Is New York going to go for Andrew Jackson or John Quincy Adams? And he was undecided, and apparently he saw a piece of paper on the floor that had Adams' name on it, and he saw that as a sign from heaven, and he decided to vote for John Quincy Adams. So a lot of Jacksonians weren't so convinced that God had intervened on his behalf, so this was a very controversial move that he made. So he was the patroon of Rensselaer. As I said, there was relative harmony until he dies in 1839. Now, he was one of the wealthiest men in America, and still to this day, he's considered one of the richest men in American history. This list there I got was from CNN. From 2014, look at those names: Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, Astor, Mellon, Carnegie, and there's Stephen Van Rensselaer. So he was considered, still to this day, one of the wealthiest men in American history. Nevertheless, he was in considerable debts, $400,000 in debt. And that same amount, coincidentally, was exactly what his tenants owed him in back rent. So when he dies, the estate is probated. His heirs realize, well, we've got a convenient solution to our problem. We have $400,000 in debt. That's what the tenants are in arrears. If we can just collect the rent from them, our problems will be over. Furthermore, he did instruct in his will that they should collect the back rents. So with that, they went around this particular region, and they started to meeting with people about collecting the back rents. But the nation was going through a very hard time. This was 1839. We were in the middle of a devastating economic recession, probably the worst of the 19th century. The Panic of 1837 is something that lasted until 1842. And in 1839, there was a particularly harsh slide. And this is one of the reasons why the patroon's family was eager to collect rents, because they were struggling too. Now, their struggles don't compare to people you see here, like in this cartoon, where he says here, I have no money and cannot get work. You see the plate is empty, and his kids are saying, Daddy, I'm hungry. These are the sort of things you saw all the time. So there was a devastating economic contraction. 60,000 tenants were living under the patroon's domain. So when they start to get their first notices that it's time to start paying up, they arrange to meet with the patroon. They arranged to meet him. They even set a date to go to his office to meet with his agents and to meet with the patroon himself. Everybody got dressed up. These were representatives from the area, tenant leaders from the area. They went there with this real specific goal in mind of trying to work out a compromise, trying to find a way to pay things off gradually, to find out terms when they could possibly buy property from the patroon. And the whole thing did not go very well. When they arrived at his office, he said, even though they made an appointment, nevertheless, he instructed he would not meet with them, and he said, submit your requests in writing. So that got things off to a very bad start. But nevertheless, they obliged. They did present their requests in writing, and the patroonship rejected this. So right away, the negotiations were off to a bad start, and the patroon was trying to set a real tone for these negotiations. That no more fooling around. The days of going easy are over. Now you have to start paying rent. So, July 4th, 1839, they gathered in the town of Berne, New York, and they drew up what they call the Second Declaration of Independence, where they made these. They had the real feel of a Declaration of Independence. The idea was, we are through paying the rent. We have paid off long enough. Now we have to talk about terms of how we can transition, because this situation has become intolerable. We cannot call ourselves a free society, a free people, and be living under a system where so much wealth and power is concentrated in the hands of one man and one family, and it affects so many people. The situation had just reached the point where change had to come. So here we start to see they were trying to galvanize a lot of the tenants. Because you can imagine, there was a lot of them. There's 16,000. And there was a wide, some people said, I don't want trouble. I will give them some of his money. Others said, no, you have to stand strong with us in solidarity. So we preserved some of these handbills and posters from the area were trying to see, telling them awake, arouse, let the opponents of patronry rally in their strength. You know, they were saying, we've got the numbers, if we just stand together and stand strong, it's the classic tactic of the strike. So here you've got a great photograph from, this is taking place now, this is the early 1840s, 1842, I think. Because this shows you some of the guerrilla tactics that they were starting to use. Because the patroon, the agents for the patroon, okay, he was sending in a sheriff, other law enforcement officials into these towns to collect the rents. And the tenants adopted these tactics to try to ward them off. They called themselves Calico Indians. There is no Indian tribe called the Calicos, but this was the name they used. You can see they wore these masks. They wore all these elaborate costumes with cloth pantaloons. They banged on pots and pans. They blew tin whistles. They had this thing whenever law enforcement came to town looking to collect rents, they would start making a loud ruckus. They wore all these costumes so no one would recognize them, so they couldn't be identified. And they would scare law enforcement out of town. People would flee. They were scared to come here because this is rugged terrain. A lot of people didn't know it very well, so the patroon was sending sheriffs and other people from law enforcement here, and they would go back to the patroon and say, sorry, these people are armed and they are dangerous and they're not fooling around, so you're going to have to find other ways to doing this. So it moves to the political arena, and the governor of New York, who was William H. Seward, you've all heard of him, he later became Lincoln's Secretary of State. He is somewhat sympathetic to their position. Nevertheless, there's this feeling that government cannot abide lawlessness of any kind. So he sends in a 500-man posse, which is mostly comprised of a lot of the famous politicians of the era. The former governor, William Marcy, John Van Buren, Martin Van Buren's son, the editor of the Albany Argus, the big newspaper in Albany, Edwin Croswell, he's among them. It's kind of funny to think that he thought a show of politicians would scare them, you know. Oh, the editor of the Albany Argus is here, we better pay up. So it went very badly. They showed up, the tenants told them what they could go do, and they had to go back. And so that whole thing flopped miserably. So with time, the anti-rent movement really became a lot more sophisticated and mature. We focus a lot on the violent aspect of this. About the calico costumes and about some of the threats we saw in that film clip. That's kind of the reputation the anti-rent movement has. But it also really spread to become a genuine grassroots political movement. They had a presence in 11 counties. They formed an actual political party, the Anti-Rent Party. They held their own convention in 1844, and they elected 8 people to the assembly. So they really wanted to take this movement and harness that strength into making it a political party that would challenge the major parties from the time. They formed civic associations. They had their own newspaper, the Albany Freehold. That was a big newspaper representing the anti-rent movement. And they had lectures that they sent all throughout the region, to not just within this area, but to Livingston Manor, any place where there was a landed estate, trying to say to people, you don't have to live under an unjust system like this. So how does all this play out in the broader political movement at the time? The two parties were the Democratic Party and the Whig Party. And the party system in America at that time was quite different from what it is today. It was far less disciplined. There were factions within each party that differed on slavery, differed on economic expansion, differed on war. Of course, this is right around the time of the Mexican War was about to start. So the parties were divided on this issue, and on the subject of the anti-rent movement, they proved to be of little value. Because even though each party had its own faction that was very sympathetic to the tenants and their complaints, and they did not like the land system in place at the time. There was also a strong sentiment that they were living under a contract and the rights of contracts were sacrosanct. This is a problem when you have too many lawyers in government. Both today and back then, there was a strong feeling that you have to live by contracts. They wanted to see this system dissolved, but gradually. And of course, this was not going to be sufficient to the tenants who were already unable to pay, living under a system where they felt was unjust. They could not meet the requirements that were needed of them. So this is what led to a lot of tension, and this is why they felt the need to create their own political parties. Now, if you go back to that clip for one moment, you remember that doctor. The doctor was based on this man, Dr. Smith Boughton. As you can see right there, he was born and raised in Vermont, and he moved over across the border, and he settled in Rensselaer County, and he was kind of a farmer doctor, which was a very popular thing at the time. But he clearly had kind of a rebellious streak in him, because in 1837, he decides to join the uprising in Canada. There was an uprising at that time, led by a man named William Mackenzie, to protest British rule in that section of Canada. They wanted their independence, and he was very moved by this, and he wanted to join their cause, and that's what he did. He went over to cross the Niagara border, and he was part of the Canadian Rebellion. After which he comes back to New York, and then when this flares up, the anti-rent movement, that kind of rebellious streak in him is revived. So he was known as a really powerful, mesmerizing public speaker. He was one who really donned all the Indian garb. He was very into that. And he even adopted an own persona. He called him Big Thunder. And he was sort of the prominent tenant leader representing in the anti-rent movement. And law enforcement was, and the political system was really determined to go after him because they felt like he was the rabble-rouser and the troublemaker who was starting a lot of this. And his speeches, again, drew big crowds from all over the area. You warned me this was slow, Joe. Let me see. Okay. It's kind of remarkable, given the intensity of the feelings and the fact that there was so much passion going on, that there really were not many instances of violence going on. And no one was seriously hurt. There was certainly some roughing up going on, things like that. No one was seriously hurt, no one was killed. Well, that all came to an end in 1845. Big Thunder gave a big speech. There was a heavy presence of law enforcement there. They were waiting for something to go wrong. The Calico Indians showed up. There was a lot of noise, a lot of whooping and hollering. Someone fired a gun. The gun misfired and killed an innocent bystander. Big Thunder was indicted, and it was a major, major trial at the time. The trial of Big Thunder. And there's a big political figure at the center of all this, and it's Martin Van Buren's son, John. The man on the left, as you could probably gather. He inherited his father's whiskers, as you can see. He looks very much like him. Van Buren tried to run for president again in 1844. He lost the nomination because he refused to come out for the annexation of Texas. He more or less retires from politics, and he decides he's going to devote his political energies toward his son, John, furthering the political career of his son, John, that he looks out for someone who's going to carry on his tradition. John Van Buren is named the Attorney General of New York. So Van Buren, again, is someone who does not like the system of the landed rights and the patents of Rensselaer Wick. He wants to see it abolished, but he wants to have this done gradually over the years, which is something not suitable to the tenants. And when this happens, when there's this killing and there's this trial, well, John Van Buren has got to be the Attorney General. So he's placed in a position he doesn't want to be in. The man in the middle, that is the judge in the trial, John Edmonds. On the right is the opposing counsel representing Dr. Smith Boughton, and his name was Ambrose Jordan. First trial ends in a mistrial. They have to do a second trial, and during the jury deliberation process, John Van Buren and Ambrose Jordan have words. And we're not quite sure what was said, but it was Jordan called Van Buren a liar. And everybody heard that. And in the world of lawyers, them's fighting words. So in the courtroom, they started having a brawl, an all-out brawl. They were throwing punches. It went on for several minutes. The judge had to order the bailiff to come in and separate them. When everything settled down, John Van Buren, who was really embarrassed by his behavior, apologized to the court. Other counsels there said, hit them with a fine so we can carry on with the trial. And the judge said, no, I have to make an example of them. I can't have things like this happening in the courtroom. So they were both assigned to 24 hours in solitary confinement. And Ambrose Jordan said, that's fine, but leave me in the same cell with Van Buren so we can continue our fight. That's the way people were back then. So this was a major embarrassment, not just to John Van Buren, but to his father and to the Van Buren family, because Martin Van Buren was legendary for his self-control. That he was someone who put up with a lot of taunting, far worse than John Van Buren ever had to deal with, and yet he always kept his cool. And John Van Buren really lost it in this one. It was a huge setback for him politically and for the family. Big Thunder, by the way, when that trial did resume, was found guilty and he was ordered to be executed. The following year, 1846, there's a New York State Constitutional Convention. We have a new constitution, and the Attorney General is someone who's no longer appointed, but now elected. So John Van Buren decides he's not going to run. The next Attorney General is Ambrose Jordan. The very man he gets into a brawl with becomes the next Attorney General. There's a new government, and Smith-Bouton's sentence is commuted from execution to life imprisonment, and a few years later, he's released. He's pardoned altogether. So he's back out. And there was a big fallout from the Big Thunder trial. Again, Van Buren lost the 1844 presidential election. He lost the Democratic nomination to James K. Polk. Everyone thought Van Buren was going to win. Polk won. He was very bitter about this. And John Van Buren was also very embittered about being put in this position of having to defend a system he really didn't like. So the Democratic Party becomes really divided over this issue, and it moves on to a national arena. The party is divided, and it goes far beyond the anti-rent movement. It actually goes on to the national stage when we have the Free Soil Party, which is a party dedicated to stopping the expansion of slavery in all the territory acquired during the Mexican War. So the Free Soil Party it's not an abolitionist party. I don't want to overstate their position. In many ways, their mission was all about trying to preserve this territory for white men. They did not want to see slavery expanded there and reducing their job opportunities. But this led to a big crack-up within the Democratic ranks. Van Buren breaks away from the party that he had helped found, the Democratic Party, and he runs for president on the Free Soil Party. He loses in 1848, but he draws away enough votes that the Democrat loses in New York State, and he helps elect a Whig president. John Van Buren is never quite able to revive his political career. The Free Soil movement does not last very long. It later becomes the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, in 1854, along with the Whig Party. This was a period of real turbulence and change in the party system of the time. So the anti-rent movement does not become the big political force in New York politics I'd envision, because it's a problem when you're a one-issue party. That's always been a problem. We had lots of them in New York at the time. We had the anti-Mason Party. There was also a party called the People's Party, which was all about trying to change voting for nominations. So there were these parties were popping up all the time because it was much easier to get a party started. You didn't have the kind of legal challenges to something that has made third parties pretty much impossible in American politics. But it was popular back then. They were able to make some noise, to run candidates, to elect people to legislatures, but they were never able to last very long. But their impact was very great. In the 1846 Constitutional Convention, there were new laws passed that made sure that these landed estates could not last for more than 12 years. So gradually, Livingston Manor, Rensselaer Work, they all gradually petered out. They sold off chunks of land, and I guess that's the reason why we don't still pay the patroon rent every single month in his wooden chair. So the anti-rent movement, again, was a real pivotal moment in New York history from this era, and it had wide-ranging repercussions, not just in New York, but in the nation as a whole. Thank you very much. Well, I'm happy to answer any questions, not only about the anti-rent war, but Dragonwyck and Van Buren and anything else. Yes?
I'm curious why Van Buren's papers are in Tennessee.
In Tennessee, yes. Not as crazy as it might sound. It's not that uncommon. Like Ulysses S. Grant papers are in Mississippi. Wherever scholars, where there's enough interest, and if they have the gumption to do it, you can start something anywhere. And of course, Van Buren was vice president to Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was an enormous political figure from the era. Van Buren was his vice president, his close political partner for many years. So the interest in Jackson leads to the interest in Van Buren. And Mark Cheatham is the name of the director of the project. He's a friend of mine, and I figured we needed an institutional backing for our project. So we've got Cumberland University, we get funding from the National Endowment of the Humanities. So we are in the midst of this right now. It's going to take place for many years, but we are posting things online, free to the public, vanburenpapers.org, and we're going to be coming out with a print edition probably next year. The first volume is called New York Years. It covers Van Buren from his very beginnings until 1821. Yes?
What happened to the average tenant farmer? Were they able to buy the farms, or do you know anything about that?
The average happened in what sense?
Well, you mentioned towards the end that the system was dissolved gradually.
Yeah.
I was just wondering how that affected the tenant farmers who raised the issue in the first place.
Yeah. They were always frustrated with how slowly things were moving. They tried to do things, they petitioned the legislatures, they sent memorials, they always felt like the political parties weren't doing enough, and every time someone had a solution, it was, let's do this gradually over 10, 12 years. It was rough. I mean, again, this was going through a difficult economic period right now, so they had a hard time adjusting. You know, with 60,000, you're going to see a diversity of things. Some people were able to carry on with their lives with some success once the recession ebbed, but others, really struggled to find their footing in a system that was in real turmoil at the time. So some prospered, and a lot of people had very, very difficult times. A lot of economic uncertainty at the time.
Thank you. You answered a question.
Yeah.
We were driving out to Williamstown last week, out Route 42 through Rensselaer County, and I caught the state ed marker on the side of the road that said Big Thunder.
Right.
And I'm thinking to myself, what the heck is Big Thunder?
And now you know.
And I meant to Google it when I got home and forgot to, and you just answered my question. So is that his residence out there? Or was it his?
It was Rensselaer County. I can't tell you which town. So which town were you in?
On the way out to Williamstown. So
Okay.
I'll find it in Google. I'll send you a picture of it.
Yeah, I'm sure that's where it was.
Right on the roadside, small little house, nothing. But it's, coming from my background, I was like, what is that? What anti-Indian, Native American, what is this crazy sign that probably
Yeah,
should
I
still be up.
mean, it's fascinating to me that they really got into it. I mean, they envisioned themselves as these warriors, and again, with the garb and costumes, and the making the whoops, and the banging the pots and pans, and the flags, and everything, all of this native imagery that they all used. And he adopted this persona. And I think this was just a big ego rush to him, that people were coming far and wide to hear him speak, and he had the costume on, and he was hoping not to be recognized, but of course everyone knew who he was. It was just a fascinating way of how they publicized the movement.
Sounds a bit like the Tea Party in Boston. Dressing up, not wanting to identify themselves.
Yeah, long tradition of that.
You know, pulling on the bad guys' beat.
And of course they used all that imagery. The revolutionary, we're free men. You know, how can we say we're free when we're living under a patroon? You know, these 17th century patents were really dubious. I mean, the way they were all put together, the surveyors, I mean, the way it mushroomed into 1 million acres. The process was absolutely corrupt. The surveyors were paid off. You look at some of these leases, and you look at the land and how everything was put down into contracts. They would say things like, well, my property extends to the tree with an X on it, and then someone could just take a knife and put an X. Oh, it's actually down there. And voila, you have 5 more acres. These things were done going to the creeks, and they would say rocks. There's a pile of rocks. That's where it extends to. I mean, it was extraordinary the way these things were done, and they were all aware of it, and they thought, why are we all abiding by something that happened under Dutch rule and later British rule? We supposedly kicked all these people out here, and nevertheless we're living under a system that they created for us. So that gave them that impetus to protest and extend that to the political arena.
And Coeymans actually was carved out of the estate pretty early.
Yeah.
With a lot of legal wrangling for 50 years, because Rensselaerwyck actually, the sewage treatment plant, Barren Island, was the southernmost outpost, and a small fort there. But Coeymans was able to get himself extracted in the 1670s, and just the fight really was just the northern boundary. But Bethlehem and Westerlo and out to Schoharie were all part of the wars. We kind of avoided, I think, most of Coeymans because all the land here was being sold by the Coeymans family back to the farmers, so. But all around us.
Yeah. Yes?
So would the tenants have ended up owning that property that they were supposedly renting?
Yes, that was the idea, that they were going to
Transition into that?
Transition.
About what time period would that have been?
Well, it would have been something that started around the late 1840s, but I know it went into the 1860s and 70s.
Okay.
I'm not, it's a little bit outside my area, that level of detail, but I know from what I understand that we're talking about a lot of land and a lot of people and a lot of transitioning that had to go on. So it dragged on for quite a while.
My great-great-grandparents were tenants in Hunter's Land in Bern. So, but at some point they left and moved to moved up to East Jewett in the Catskill Mountains.
Yeah.
We always wonder why did they leave?
Yeah.
First off, if you think about where Hunter's, I don't know if you know where Hunter's Land is, but if you come in from Middleburg, if you're heading up to Bern, it's kind of at the bottom of the hill just before you get into Schoharie County. And then they're transitioning from there to East Jewett. If anybody's been to East Jewett in the Catskills, it's in the middle of the mountains.
Right.
And this is 1840s they're traveling?
It's also called the Helderberg Wars. It's another term for this, because of the mountains. And the mountains, of course, were a big help to them in the sense that people were afraid, they didn't quite sure how to make their way around there, and they knew it very well, so they did a good job of spooking the authorities.
James, who followed Stephen Van Rensselaer III? Who actually was the patroon during the...
Well, Stephen Van Rensselaer IV, and there was a brother of his, William Van Rensselaer. William was the one really pushing for strong enforcement of the rent collection, much more than his son. So So he was technically, but Stephen Van Mans is considered the last of the patroons. Yeah. The whole word patroons comes from patrone, this idea of the patron out there, and people saying, you know, why? We don't need a patron. That's how they felt. So, any other questions? All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.